Happy Halloween, everyone. Do you know that a rabbi could never utter such a thing in a synagogue just years ago? I'm guessing there's still some synagogues that it would still be frowned upon today. So the question is why? Why is there's always this sense that Jews are not supposed to celebrate Halloween? And I ask you, does anyone know why? What's that? It's a pagan, I didn't know where it came from. Someone said it's a pagan holiday. So what? What does that mean, it's a pagan holiday? Idol worship. Okay, so one was this fear that somehow we would get engaged in what was the most sinful behavior in the Bible, which is idol worship. Why else? Yeah. So it honors the saints, so that's still in the same realm. I'd still put that in the same category, and that somehow we might not want to be honoring the saints but there's a reason. You go a step further. We want to be distinct from that, right? We don't want to align ourselves with every other religion, especially a predominant one in this country. And then there's a third reason that we've sort of stayed away from this one, and Valentine's Day, someone else might say. What's that? So you're getting close. So you're bringing Satan up as part of it, right? But what would happen is that it would become an anti-Semitic trope. And sometimes the worst of anti-Semitic attacks would happen on these days, on these pagan holidays, and somehow if people got too sugared up with candy or too liquored up with liquor, they would turn their rage or even their joy into attacking Jews. The truth is that when I was a young rabbi at Rodef Shalom, I was forbidden as this young rabbi to allow any kids in our day school to come dressed up in costumes. This morning when I went for breakfast to meet someone in South Orange, every single kid going to middle school were in all kinds of costumes. And in fact, I was told that I was clearly forbidden to even talk about the idea that it was Halloween. So obviously I wanted to keep my job, so the first couple of years I did so. When I gained enough forbidden capital, I decided to go my own course and obviously bring it up because it was ridiculous to think that this sacrosanct holiday for our kids was something that shouldn't be brought up. In fact, I remember my youngest, Sadie, was maybe 6 years old, 7 years old, perhaps even as old as 8. And it was late August, early September. I was trying to make sure I was getting her ready for the Jewish holidays. And I said, there are 4 that happen in the fall. There's Rosh Hashanah. She said, yes, Daddy, that's the world's birthday. Somehow she goes to Sukkot, where we live in these outdoor huts. The Torah's birthday, Simchat Torah. And I said, but what's the holiest holiday that happens in the fall? And without missing a beat, she said, Halloween, Daddy, not Yom Kippur. You know, there's this tension always for Jews, ever since we came to these shores, between particularity and universality. And the truth is that it was seen really, really well, and it's funny, seeing a crowd that hasn't been sitting together for many years. I'll bust your chops again tomorrow, you folks. My OGs are here. Gavin, they're all here for you to come back for you. When I was hired here, I almost didn't get the job because I was told I was too Jewish. And I didn't understand what that meant. So I said, tell me more what you mean. Well, you know you wear that thing called a talit, and you wear that thing called a kippah, and you speak a lot of that language called Hebrew. And here was the kicker. We're not sure if we want to hire someone with facial hair. This right here, this little thing that's turned nice and gray as I've gotten older. Facial hair, in fact, and Ken or Stoll would know this better than I have, and I see a picture. I was told, at least, that I was the first senior rabbi in our history that was hired with facial hair. There was someone way back
1860.
In the 1860s, so they were a little bit more liberal then. But what did people mean when they told me, or they told anyone? It was a big subject of discussion for my first couple of years here. How Jewish is this place going to be? By the way, the conversation doesn't happen anymore, not just because we've changed, but I think other outside factors have impacted that kind of conversation. But what they meant was that they did not want to go back to Europe. They did not want to go back to Russia. They did not want to go specifically back to ghetto life there, to shtetl life there, where you only lived one kind of way and you acted in one kind of manner. And what happened to those Jews? They were oppressed. They were sent to concentration camps. They were subjected to pogroms. So when you got here to these shores, you wanted to do everything you could to be the exact opposite of that, to the point where many synagogues had bar bat mitzvahs not on Shabbat but on Sunday, because they wanted to act like the church. They decided to have synagogues that looked like this because they were modeled after the church. And not because they wanted to be Christian, but they wanted to blend in as to be as American as possible. And it left us in this whole tension of somehow not being able to be proud of who we were overtly, because we wanted to prove first that we were American before we were Jewish. This is a tension that some of you sitting here remember quite well. There would always be these debates. They'd have whole classes on, are you a Jewish American or are you an American Jew? I'm telling you, we get so much mileage out of these classes because the issues of identity meant so much back then. And again, I'll just sort of say to you, given the anti-Semitism today, the Jew hatred today, that conversation is now a luxury. No one cares. When someone says, hey, what kind of rabbi are you? They're asking the denominational question. And I answer, I hope I'm a good one. Because I no longer care if I'm Reform or Conservative or Orthodox. I want us to be Jews in unity and solidarity. But the tension has come up again in different ways, especially on nights like this. And it's a tension that goes back to this week's Torah portion. The cantor sang so beautifully the song Lechi Lach. When the two of you become bat mitzvah and bar mitzvah tomorrow, that's the song they play underneath. As we bless you, you go forth to this new land. You come of age as a beautiful young lady and a beautiful young man. But the truth is that that journey way back when, thousands of years ago, was about leaving something. It was leaving idolatry. It was leaving sacrificing of the firstborn. It was leaving a certain way of being that we didn't want to be, and it was also going towards finding one God. We wanted to be particular. We wanted to distinguish ourselves from everyone else. But the truth is, it's one thing to leave idol worship. It's one thing to go to a monotheistic understanding of God. It's another thing altogether to manifest that into living in a ghetto, to living in a shtetl. And what do I mean by that? I want to be very clear. I told you before that I'm more post-denominational than I am particular to any one denomination. But I still don't love when people somehow feel like they have to shut themselves off from the world. Israel is the best example. Jerusalem, I tend to get lost on streets during sabbatical times, taking walks for hours, not caring where I end up because I want to see each and every neighborhood. One time last year or the year before that, I ended up in a neighborhood that I always visited, one called Mea Shearim. Anyone ever hear of the neighborhood? It is where one of the most ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods probably in the world, like Lakewood, like Closter, like Muncie. Why is that so funny? Are you from there? Okay, so I'll have to ask you later after services. But when I got there, I wanted to be respectful. I put on a kippah. I was dressed in ways that were not considered risque, but everyone knew that I wasn't from the community. And it wasn't just being looked at. I ended up leaving the neighborhood because I felt like I was going to get hit. There were looks given to me like, what are you doing here? You don't belong here. You shouldn't be part of this neighborhood. And I literally knew that if I made a left, I'd end up back in Machane Yehuda, back in the market. But I didn't understand how I could be in a Jewish neighborhood and somehow not feel safe. There's another phenomenon in these neighborhoods called the kosher phone. I know a lot of you are worried about kosher food, but kosher phones. Anyone know what a kosher phone is? So a kosher phone is everything that's not a smartphone. That's like the old flip phones we had. And the point of that is to make sure that you're not connected to the internet, because being connected to the internet, to the outer world, to the universal nature of the world, means that you're going to be exposed to things that perhaps, if you want to be able to live a certain kind of life, you're not going to be exposed to. And guess what? It doesn't work. How do I know? Because on that same trip, I would see someone in public go like this, turn around into the corner, put in their hands in the pocket, then go like this. Meaning they wanted to check the internet, they checked around, they weren't on the phone, but they were, because you can't keep people away from modernity. It just doesn't work. Ultimately, people are going to hide and go their own ways. You see, we're supposed to, and I want to make this distinction. I think that this phenomenon is not a religious phenomenon. I think it's a sociological one. What do I mean? That we're supposed to act distinctively, but we're not supposed to live distinctively. What's the difference between acting and living? Acting, we're supposed to be something called kadosh. Kadosh means holy, but in simple terms, all it means is being separate. But everyone makes the mistake of thinking it means separate from other people, but no, it doesn't. It just means acting separate like the divine does. When we go to feed someone who's hungry, we're acting separate like God. When we go to clothe someone who's naked, we're acting separate like God. When we free people from oppression, we're acting separate like God, but not acting separate from other people. Anyone, a Jew, a Christian, a Muslim, a Buddhist, a Hindu, anyone can act in that way. And it's separate not because we're separate from each other, but because we want to be separate from the person that doesn't act that way, that we are as close to God as possible. The truth is that we were not supposed to put ourselves in ghettos. We were forced into ghettos. And we got used to that life. And we got used to that way of being. And the truth is, I call it sociological because I think what happened is that we got so scared of the horrible things that happened to us. And they were horrible. The pogroms depicted in Fiddler on the Roof, the movie like Schindler's List, none of it comes close to the oppression, to the misery, to the completely animalistic behavior that our people went through. But the truth is that if you look back on our history, Abraham and Sarah, who did walk away from a certain life, who did walk towards another kind of life, they lived that life, but they engaged with others. They hosted others. They were both separate and they were mixed in. And for too long, we lived in this pendulum where either we whitewashed our Judaism altogether into some kind of bland American mix, or we separated ourselves in ways that keep us completely different from everyone else. I got into a bit of trouble, 7, 8, 9 years ago. We'll go back to Sadie again, who loved Halloween. Well, she also turns out that she loved Santa Claus. What can I tell you? The rabbi's youngest daughter believed in Santa Claus. You know, I believed in Santa Claus also until a certain age. I remember I used to stay up on Christmas Eve because I wanted to prove to my brother that Santa was going to come on his sleigh and was going to go to Jimmy Brennan's house across the street. And I would stay up as long as I could, whatever that meant. I'd fall asleep. And sometimes I would ask Jimmy, and he would tell me about the cookie that was, I'm telling you, Matt, half a cookie was eaten last night. I believed that until I wanted to sit on Santa's lap at Bloomingdale's. And I remember saying, Mom, and she said, okay, you're Jewish, but go ahead. And then when I got on his lap and I smelled his breath, and I realized how scraggly, I realized there wasn't a Santa Claus anymore. Sadie believed in Santa Claus, and for some reason my instinct was to allow her to believe it. You're not going to, maybe you'll get mad at me also. I wrote a whole article about this and got into a bit of trouble. So the older kids would make fun of her for believing it. Jake and Talia were just horrible to her. So to get them back and to make sure that I sort of sustained her sense of magical thinking, of mystical thinking, I would break a cookie in half during the night. I would leave her a present and said yes, and a note from Santa, a whole letter I would write to her, and say to her, I know you're Jewish, and I know you love Hanukkah, and I know you think Halloween's the most important holiday in the world, but Santa also loves you, and etc. So eventually I knew she was not going to believe it anymore, but the reason I did it is because somehow for her, it was a gateway into belief. And I don't mean Christian belief, I mean the idea that something beyond ourselves was possible. Now, people always ask me if any of my kids are going to become a rabbi. I promise you, the first two are the furthest things from a rabbi you could ever imagine. But if there's any shot, who is it going to be? It's going to be Sadie, the Santa lover, who's going to end up becoming a rabbi. And why? Because we live in a country where this stuff revolves around us. And to make believe that none of it is true, that we are distinct, that by eating Chinese food and going to the movies on Christmas is going to somehow separate us from the world, it's just not true. And the same thing was raising my kids, all three of whom, especially two of them, are athletes, when it came to the same issue you had about if there was a game on a day that the kid had religious school, or if there was a championship game on the day of a holiday. And we made decisions probably exactly like you, because I decided that when Jake played baseball, it was not going to take away from his Judaism, and his Judaism was not going to take away from his baseball. That somehow when I was a kid, some of these things felt like punishments. Like going to religious school was suddenly a punishment. All my friends would be there and they said, you who hits cleanup, you're going to ruin our team. And that conflict was intense. Now, on one hand, you have Sandy Koufax. I think this was the 50th year of him not playing on Yom Kippur, and there were certain lines we draw because we have to, because we're Jewish, and we are going to be different. And there are some times on a Tuesday of religious school where it's okay for your kid to go play a baseball game because somehow he's also part of an American fabric, and all of that is true together. So I will say, all things being equal, we want to be accepted for our particularity. We really do. And we also want to be proud Americans all at once. That's why you hear me get up and you say, why are you talking about something like democracy from the pulpit? It's political, and it is political. But Jews have only thrived, have been free enough to be who they are, behave how they want to act, wear what they want to wear, have the beard, have the whatever you want to be. That only happens in countries where they allow freedom. And that's why we fight so much for things like freedom of speech and freedom of everything else we fight for, because that's where Jews have always thrived. And so the truth is, years and years ago, I was not allowed to mention the word Halloween to my kids at the Road of Shalom Day School. But tonight, look at the bima. Cantor Stahl came, our cantor emeritus, who you all know very well, our assistant cantor, whose kid is too young to understand Halloween. But the other three clergy, the other two rabbis, and the other cantor, you know where they are right now? They're trick-or-treating with their kids. So and by the way, there used to be days where I would leave and come out loud. My kids' baseball game was oftentimes Friday. I would go to the game, and I showed up here a half hour late and told you exactly where I was. Because we've made the decision to live in this country. It's okay for me to end a sermon like this by saying two things to you. Happy Halloween, and Shabbat Shalom.
We can